There is a new kid on the block, the QooCam EGO from Kandao. In my mind, this is the first real contender as a 3D point and shoot camera apart from the 10-year-old Fujifilm camera. Hello, my name is Andreas and welcome to my channel. I think we're going to have a look at a few interesting things. We're going to have a look at how does this camera compare to the old Fujifilm camera? And what is this interesting contraption? Can you view not just the photos that you shoot, but your other content with this viewer as well? Can you stream with this camera? Can you stream in 3D? Can you stream to your LoomPad, to your VR headset, or to YouTube? Stay with me as we have a look at all those things and more. Alright, to start off with, I've got to show you this. This camera comes with a viewer, and that can be attached. Actually, it's the wrong way around. You can feel that because of the magnets. I'm going to attach that, and it latches in, and also is held in there magnetically. And then you can view things on this camera stereoscopically. Does this remind you of something? Does it remind you of the Viewmaster from many, many years ago? I think it's intended to. And I quite like it. I quite like the look of it. And I have to admit that looking through this, I haven't got it on at the moment, but looking through that, it gives you that same sort of feel. Now, I just wanted to show you that to start off with. But I also want to say that there have been a number of reviews that have been made of this camera already. And I don't really want to compete with that. I don't necessarily just have to add another review. But I do see some things that have not been covered. And that's what I really want to focus in on. Some of the things that you can do with this camera that are not so obvious. So I'll focus in on those. But I do also want to be complete. So I am going to cover some of the general things as well. But I won't focus so much on those. I'll focus more on the new things that you may not have heard. So let's start with that. Okay, let's have a quick look at the camera. It's got a trigger, a power button, and a speaker here at the top. 2 lenses and 2 microphones at the front. And this here is a status LED indicator. At the rear, it's got another status LED indicator and a touchscreen. And these cut-off corners are just dedicated button areas on top of the touchscreen. On the side here we have the playback buttons. The top one takes you to the playback function and also acts as the OK button to stop and start video, for example. And these two are next and previous buttons. On the other side here we have a latch door that opens to the battery, the SD card and the USB connector. I'll show you how to open this latch. It's not necessarily all that obvious. There are those, including me, that have struggled with this. So to save you from destroying your camera, let me show you how simple it really is. Pull down here, then lift. Don't try to pry, scratch, or open it like this. Now let's have a look. And there you see the battery, the SD card, and the USB connector. Also, let's have a quick scan of what's on the screen. At the top, you have indicators for your SD card, Wi-Fi, and battery status. There's also a on-screen trigger that you can use. At the bottom, you have some camera settings. Here you can switch between video and photo cameras. The camera only has manual focus, so you will need to select between these 6 steps ranging from 25 centimeters to infinity. It will cover that later. By the way, I'll put a mark on this and I'll do the same thing for other things that I'll talk about later as well. To change the settings down here, swipe up and you can change the exposure offset, the file format, and only JPEG is currently supported. You can set a timer between 0 and 10 seconds, and you can set the exposure to either be auto or sport mode. Sport mode is for faster movement. Video has similar settings. You can set the frames per second here between 30 and 60 frames per second. All videos are MP4. Then when you swipe down, you can change some other things. You can toggle the Wi-Fi on or off. You can lock the camera. You can set screen brightness. In settings here, you can provide an account that will then allow you to download other people's photos. You can configure Wi-Fi. You can set the battery saver mode. You can specify automatic lock. And that basically does the same thing as the lock that I showed you before, but automatically activates after some inactivity. You also have auto shutdown, and that also activates after some time of inactivity. Auto stop recording allows you to set the temperature at which recording stops. The function setting allows you to determine what you want this Q button here to do. I generally set that to just lock the screen. You can set the system sound level. You can set grid lines on or off. You can set the anti-flicker frequency. You can set the date and time. You can set the language. You can determine what happens when you connect your USB, whether it's for file transfer or to charge your camera. And from here you can also format your SD card. And also obtain storage information. You can perform a factory reset, and here you have other camera information, including regulatory information. Now there's a mode that we have not yet covered. It's the playback mode, and this operates not unlike other cameras where you can play back your photos and videos that you've taken. One thing that's worth pointing out is that you can view other people's photos. And you can do that by selecting this here and entering a code. This code needs to be provided by the person that's sharing it with you. And when you enter this, it will download that video or that photo from the cloud, as long as you're connected with Wi-Fi and as long as you're connected with your account. And that's the camera in a nutshell. Fairly simple, really. The camera doesn't just have the screen as an interface, but you can also use a mobile app to interface with the camera. So you just connect, and let's have a look at what you can do with that. So just connecting up now, and you can either do that by hotspotting your phone directly or connecting your phone to the same Wi-Fi network that you have your camera connected to. Once connected, you get this warning. This can be ignored, I'm told. So here you get some very similar controls to what you get in the camera itself. And I'll show you these side by side for a moment. By the way, you can put this into landscape mode just by turning your phone. When you get into the settings, you will still mostly need to go back to the camera for most of those. But there are some that are accessible here, such as anti-flicker and the auto stop recording temperature. But there's also some additional settings that are not available on the camera, such as stabilization, and more on that later, and save location information and shutter vibration feedback. The real difference in the mobile app, however, doesn't lie in the camera side of things, but it lies in the player mode. When you switch to the player mode, not only can you review your content, but there's also some editing and some sharing functionality. There is, of course, the album that sits on the camera itself. From here you can view thumbnails of that album. Another album is on your mobile phone, and another is in the Kandao cloud. From the one on the Kandao Cloud, you can share images and specify how long you want to share them for. This is what I showed earlier. To edit video and images, you need to operate from the album on your mobile phone. So let's go to that first. For images, you can toggle between 2D and 3D. You can add 3D whales and jellyfish or hearts. I'm going to just go for none. You can apply a filter to change your color scheme or even create a sketch drawing. Oh wow, not sure what this is, but it's called wow. For editing videos, you can do the same, but in addition, you can also add music.
Stop that.
So I better stop that, otherwise I'll get pinged for copyright, I'm sure. You can also trim your video, and here you can toggle stabilization on or off, and again, more on that later. And again, you can just toggle between 2D and 3D. One at the top here, for both images and videos, you can undo your edits by restoring the default. From here, you can also upload your images to the cloud album or share to social media. When uploading to the cloud, you can select between mono, side by side, half side by side, and parallel formats. I suggest that you upload side by side, as that can then also be shared with others. When sharing, you'll be provided with a code, and you can then provide that to others so that they can download your footage. You can also share on social media, and you have a number of different options, as you can see here. Now, although this looks like this is a one-button operation, in a number of cases it's a bit more involved and takes you to instructions. For this, you can also just transfer your files to your PC, either by USB or direct transfer from the SD card, and then share from there. That's actually my preferred method anyway. There are a couple of tabs here that we've not covered yet. The Smart Clip guides you to making certain types of videos, such as hyperlapses and other special effects. And the tutorial section here has some tutorial videos. Note that much of this content is actually not relevant to the QooCam EGO camera, as this app also connects to other Kandao cameras that take VR 360 footage. And the content largely relates to that. I'm sure that given time, there will be more QooCam EGO content here also. And that's it for the app. Again, fairly straightforward. Okay, let's have a look at some of those things that I said I would talk a little bit more on when I took us through the walkthrough of this camera just then. And the first topic that I want to cover is focus. Now, I mentioned that this camera only has manual focus. So unlike the Fujifilm camera that I often compare to, which only has automatic focus, this camera only has manual focus. Now, on the Facebook forum of Kandao, I've heard a number of comments of people that have indicated that they see that as a fairly major issue. And generally speaking, I think you would. But I would argue that it's actually not that big of an issue. And the reason that I say that is because 3D cameras are actually only suitable for a certain distance range. And that comes about due to the interocular eye distance that the camera has. Now, this camera has an interocular eye distance that's very similar to your own eyes. And I think it's intended to be that. Now, other devices, such as binoculars, they have a interocular eye distance that's greater than your eyes. And that's deliberate again, in order to be able to see things further in the distance. Imagine that that was not the case, and many binoculars don't have that. when you see things further away, what your left eye sees is essentially the same as your right eye over a great distance. So you don't see things stereoscopically anymore. The further you separate the eyes, though, the more separation is in the left eye and the right eye, and the more you see things stereoscopically. So that's quite deliberate, that the mirrors inside these binoculars create an interocular distance that's greater than your natural eyes. And that may be suitable then for a distance range of say 10 meters and beyond. Then there's other cameras to take the opposite extreme that have an interocular eye distance that's less than your eyes. An example of that is your hydrogen 1 camera. Here you have an interocular distance that's possibly suitable for taking food photography of things that are quite close to you, sort of less than a meter, and those things appear quite stereoscopically. Now, if you have a interocular eye distance such as you have with this camera that's similar to your own eyes, that range is maybe suitable for 1 meter to 10 meters. And I would basically fix the camera focus to that and then frame my shots around that rather than changing the focus of the camera all the time. So I hope that makes sense. I know it would be nice to have autofocus on there, then you wouldn't have to worry about that. But what I'm arguing is that you don't actually have to change focus all that much anyway. Now, having said that, that focus is not so much of an issue, or the manual focus is not so much of an issue, there is a focus issue with this camera that I do want to talk about. And that is that if you face the camera forward, then the focus is according to the settings that you set in the manual focus. But that's only when you face it forward. When you face the camera downwards, or when you point the camera upwards, that no longer applies. So that's a bug with the camera. It's a known issue. Kandao does know about that and intends to do something about that. But the reason I mention it is because you can manually compensate for that. I just want you to be aware of that so that you can do something about it when you frame your shots. So basically you have to make adjustments when you point it down or when you point it upwards that are different to the settings that are indicated on the manual focus range. Now, to show you this, I put a test sheet exactly 110 centimeters away from the camera, and I did this in all cases. I then adjusted the focus and noticed that the camera indeed focused correctly at 110 centimeters with the camera pointing forwards. I then pointed the camera upwards and noticed now that it was in focus at the 40 centimeter setting instead of the 110 centimeter setting where it was supposed to be in focus. I then pointed the camera downwards and noticed that it was in focus at infinity. Again, the sheet is still actually at 110 centimeters from the camera. So essentially, to correct for this, you have to imagine a scale that is placed 2 notches upwards when the camera is pointing downwards, and 2 notches downwards when the camera is pointing upwards. Because of this offset, some settings actually become inaccessible. For example, here, the 30 and 40 centimeter settings are effectively off scale and can no longer be reached. When pointing downwards, the 2 meter and infinity settings are effectively off scale and can no longer be reached. So in the end, make sure that you are aware of that and you compensate for that manually. The reason that this happens, by the way, is because of voice coil motors that are responsible for focusing the lenses. And I believe as the camera points downwards, there's some weight placed on that changes the actual focus, and the opposite happens when you point it upwards. And obviously that needs to be compensated for. But right now, before it's automatically compensated, you can compensate for that manually yourself. Sport mode. Let's talk about sport mode. On DSLR cameras, you may be familiar that there are settings that control exposure. ranging from automatic, where the camera does everything, to manual, where you can control everything. And in between, you've got settings like program mode, shutter priority, and aperture priority. Now with the QooCam EGO, you also have an automatic mode, but it's a little bit different. And that aperture on the QooCam EGO is fixed. And that's not unlike a lot of the mobile phone cameras where the aperture is also fixed. There's no aperture mechanism in these cameras. So that's one variable we have no control over. And that basically leaves only ISO and shutter speed that we can control. Now in the case of the QooCam EGO, in automatic mode, the ISO is also fixed at 96, which only leaves the shutter speed as a variable that the camera can control. So in that respect, it's very similar to a aperture priority mode with a fixed aperture of f/1.8. Now it gets interesting when we look at our sport mode. With sport mode, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Here you cap the shutter speed so that it doesn't go any slower. And the reason for that is if you have fast moving objects, which is why this is called sports mode, you want to be able to capture those objects without any blur. And if the shutter speed becomes slow, so if you have a long exposure time, then things become blurry. And to avoid that, you set your cap such that the shutter speed is always faster than a setting that you specify. So let me just explain that using a graph. And here we are back in auto mode. And as the light intensity increases, you'll see that the shutter is faster. It lets less light in. The exposure time is reduced. And as we have less light moving towards the cloud here, the shutter speed decreases and the exposure time increases. In all these cases, ISO is set the same. It's only the exposure time that is varied. Now when we go to sports mode, what we do is we want to say that the shutter speed is capped. It should under no circumstances go any slower than 1/125. That's one of the settings. And when that happens in low light conditions, then of course our image would, unless we change the ISO, become darker. So to make up for it, the ISO needs to be changed. And this is basically what that looks like. So in low light conditions, it's the ISO that gets changed. And in conditions where there's lots of light, we still change the exposure time as we did before. So that's no different. It's only in low light conditions that you see this change happening. And in low light conditions, that's where things would start to become blurry, and we don't want that. So to make up for that, we change the ISO. Now there is a trade-off. So in this mode, in the sport mode, you won't get the blur. You will be able to see things that are moving fast. As a compromise for that, you will have more grain in your images. Now you have another setting where the shutter speed is set even more aggressively for even faster movement. And here you can set it such that the exposure time will never be greater than 1/250th of a second. And again, ISO is going to be adjusted once you hit that limit in low light conditions. But this time it's going to reach that limit much quicker. About stabilization. You can switch stabilization in your settings, and you can also switch it when you're editing a video. Now what I want to point out here is that when you are switching in either place, you are actually configuring the same setting. It's just switched in two different places. And that setting allows you to switch stabilization on or off. Now you have to remember that this stabilization is a post-processing step. So it doesn't take place during the time you're recording the video. It doesn't take place in your camera. It takes place in your mobile phone app. So when you export your video from your mobile phone app, or when you view it there and you have stabilization set, you will see it stabilized, which is good. But you also have to remember that because it doesn't take place in your camera, when you export it from your camera, you will not have a stabilized video although you can still stabilize it, but you just have to use an external application to do that post-processing. Now, if you wanted to get a stabilized image directly out of the camera, you would have to use some sort of a gimbal. Now, I've tried, and I've attached this camera to my DJI OM5, and you can see it's a bit of a hack. I've strapped it to it. It doesn't attach normally to it because this clip here is intended for a mobile phone, not really for a camera like this. But I managed to get it on there. But there's another problem. If I switch this on, and I've got to orientate it the right way as well, you can see that that's just not going to work, right? For obvious reasons. You've got this arm here that's going to be in front of one of the lenses. So even if you do strap it on like that, that's not going to work. Now, that's not to say that this camera won't work with a gimbal. It's just not going to work with this one. I'm sure that there are gimbals for which this camera is going to be suitable. I just haven't got one myself. Let's talk about auto stop recording temperature and the battery saver mode. Now, those two are actually related, and that's because of power use. This camera actually uses quite a bit of power, it seems, because it gets hot and it also drains quite a lot of battery. Let's just have a look at the battery. It's a fairly large battery, and it does get hot in general. Now, there are, for that reason, these battery saver modes and also protection against temperature escalation. And I would recommend that you use them. But even if you use them, there is still quite a bit of battery power that is used. So the best way to get around that, obviously, would be to switch off your camera when you don't need it. But that also doesn't really solve the problem, because the camera also takes quite a bit of time to boot up. And if you want to take a shot right there and then, by the time you've got it booted up, it may be too late to take that shot. So what you really want is for the camera to remain on. Obviously, with battery drainage, that could be a problem. So the thing that I would recommend that you do is to either get a few extra batteries or have a battery power pack, an external battery power pack with you as well. Okay, let's have a look at the viewer now. How does it work? It starts with the camera display splitting the view into left and right when the magnets of the viewer activate a switch on the camera like this. I'm showing this with the viewer placed to the side so you can see what happens, but normally the viewer would of course cover the screen. The split image is then fed into the two windows, and it goes through an optical system and are then projected to the eyepieces. You may notice that it has these corners here, and they do actually cut the corners of the image. But I don't actually find that it takes too much away from the image, and it actually gives it that retro type of Viewmaster feel. So I quite like it. Obviously, the original image doesn't have these corners cut out, so you can view them with any other external viewer in full. Talking about field of view, let's do a bit of a dive into that. The camera has a field of view of 66 degrees, and that's something that's in the specifications. And the viewer has a field of view of 33 degrees, and that's something I've measured myself. This means that the images viewed through the viewer will appear somewhat smaller than in real life. So when looking through the viewer as a viewfinder, which is something that you can do, by the way, things will appear similar to when you look through some weak binoculars in reverse, just with a wider field of view. And this actually looks quite good. 33 degrees doesn't appear small. You have to remember that it's the actual physical device of the viewer that is the constraint here, since most of your view beyond that is actually just peripheral vision of the real world outside of the device itself. So I can still view things outside the device if I look 45 degrees, for example. Okay, talking about using the viewer as a viewfinder, it's worth noting that it has a 90-degree bend in it. So as you point the camera forward, you will notice that you have to look down into the viewfinder in order to take pictures. Now, that actually becomes a little bit confusing because we're used to turning our heads in order to pan the camera, right? But when you have the viewfinder attached, when you turn your head, right, when you turn your head, your camera actually tilts. So what you need to do is you actually need to tilt your head in order to pan the camera. Now, like I said, that's a little bit confusing, but there is an upside to having the viewer attached like that and having a 90-degree bend in it. With a viewer, unlike what you have in the Fujifilm camera, or if you don't attach the viewer to this camera, the sun will cause glare on your screen. And sometimes that glare is so bad that you cannot see what you're taking a picture of. So having a viewer on there is actually quite useful. And on top of that, having that 90-degree bend looking downwards into it causes shade onto the viewer. So you don't get any of that glare, which is quite nice. The other thing that I want to point out whilst we've got the viewer attached is that you do not have access to the touch screen, of course. So all those settings that we talked about before, you don't have access to. But there are some shortcuts that you can use in order to still have access to things when you have the viewer attached. So you can enter playback mode by pressing the playback button. And if you want to return to the camera mode, then you press the trigger button. If you want to switch between your video and your camera, you can press the power button, but just short press it. Don't press it too long, obviously, otherwise you're going to shut your camera down. But you can switch between them just by short pressing on that. And also, whilst you're short pressing on that, it brings up the information that's normally hidden, I've noticed, when you have the viewer attached, and brings that up as well. So you can see battery status and all of your settings that would otherwise be off view. So if you want to get to those, just short press that button as well. You'd obviously have to go back to the mode that you're interested in, but that's one way of seeing that information whilst you've got the viewer attached. What else is there? Yes, there is something I've noticed when I watched this waterfall footage. I felt that the fast moving parts just didn't quite look right. I felt there was some mismatch between the left and the right eye. So I investigated this further. I suspected that this is because of some timing issue. So I took some slow motion footage of a timer and looked for any discrepancies between the left and the right eyes. And sure enough, there was a slight difference, as you can see in this frame. One side is lagging by about 20 milliseconds from the other. This normally wouldn't be much of an issue, of course, but when you have something like this waterfall, where the image changes quite significantly from frame to frame, this does come into play. Also be aware that this is only a viewer issue. It is not an issue with the original content itself. The playback software in the camera causes this, not the camera capture functionality. So your original content watched in any other player will not have this issue. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about relating to the viewer. It's the ability to play back external content. Now, this is not as straightforward as it may seem, but it can be done. I could not get, for example, my side-by-side JPEG images to play back that I converted from my MPO files. But after translating them to an MP4 video slideshow, I was able to view that. To do that, simply place the file into the video directory of your SD card and rename the file to match the next sequence of files already there from onboard footage. For example, if moving this external file to the SD card, then look at the file name here and rename the imported file to have the next sequence number, today's date, and a 01 at the end, just like all the other files here. And then play back using the viewer and enjoy. Now let's take a moment just to compare this camera with the old Fujifilm 3D-W3 camera. Now this camera obviously didn't come with a mobile phone app. This was pre-mobile phone app days. But mind you, they did try to introduce functionality for sharing the content. There is an infrared port on this, and that was actually never used, but kudos for trying. Now, let's compare the cameras side by side. And you'll notice that there are a number of features not present in the QooCam EGO. But I was actually surprised to see how many I did not really care too much about. Okay, let's start. Number 1. The eye distance of the QooCam EGO is quite comparable to the Fujifilm, and I find that important. Number 2. The Fujifilm camera has a parallax adjustment. For the QooCam EGO, this would need to be performed post-production. Number 3. The Fujifilm camera has a 2D mode, and I don't really think that is needed. You can always generate a 2D video or image from a 3D video or image. Number 4. The QooCam EGO doesn't have any resolution settings. So essentially everything is captured in the highest resolution, which is 4000 by 3000 pixels for images and 1080p for video. And this is not an issue that you don't have these settings, because memory is cheap these days. Talking about resolution though, you can see that video has a significant better resolution and frame rate than the Fujifilm camera. This is where I see the biggest strength of the QooCam EGO. There has been much talk on my channel about the lack of video quality for the Fujifilm, and this certainly addresses that issue. Number 5. The Fujifilm camera has optical zoom, and I'm not too concerned about the QooCam EGO not having this, for reasons I explained earlier. A 3D camera is only really suitable for a given distance range. By framing distances closer or further away that are outside of that range doesn't really add all that much value. So it's a nice to have, but it's not really a must-have in my mind. Number 6. The QooCam EGO only has manual focus. And again, not a huge issue, and I've talked about that earlier as well for similar reasons. Number 7. The QooCam EGO doesn't have any onboard flash. Okay, do we want flash? Actually, I would argue yes and no. Having an onboard flash on any 3D camera is at exactly the wrong location. It causes unwanted shadows to be displayed in the disparity regions. These are the regions where you need good lighting, not shadows, to view things in good stereoscopic 3D. So no, you do not want to have a flash there. That can be ditched. But you may want to have an external flash elsewhere. This is where the issue lies. How are you going to trigger an external flash if there is no trigger signal? The onboard flash, you see, itself can be used as such a trigger, but if there is no flash, as it is in this case, then what are you left with? That leaves you without the ability to use a flash at all, and that is, in my mind, where the issue lies. Not so much that there is no flash in itself, but in the lack of being able to trigger an external flash. Number 8. There is no aperture. Now remember, we talked about this earlier with regards to the sport mode setting. Of course, having an aperture would be a nice feature. It would allow you to shoot with different depths of fields. Okay, now for our final topic. I have discovered that you can stream from this camera and just wanted to share that with you. You can share using the real-time streaming protocol, and that is often abbreviated as RTSP. This is a video streaming technology that has been around for some time, and these days is often used for IP cameras. It is a standard that is used for CCTV cameras. With this, you can stream to your PC using video players such as your VLC player. You can stream to YouTube using streaming apps like OBS, which also support this protocol. Once you're streaming on YouTube, you can then share that stream to any device that supports YouTube side-by-side content, such as the Volvic internet browser on a VR headset. You can also use virtual desktop to mirror your desktop to your VR headset and then switch to the appropriate side-by-side mode, either half width or full width. You can also stream to the LoomPad using the Layer Tube application, or to the Chroma King tablet using the 3DFV application. Okay, here we are near the end of this video. Let me just share with you my overall impression of this camera. And I think it's great to see that there is finally a standalone stereo point and shoot camera that has emerged that is really worth talking about. This being the first release, of course, there are things that can be improved, but this is a great start. An idea, for example, that I think would be worth as an enhancement would be to have the ability to remotely view what's on the camera with a stereo viewfinder. Of course, the camera has a viewfinder that you can attach to the camera, but what if you had a remote viewer, a cardboard type viewer that you can use your mobile phone with to see what's happening on the camera remotely? I think that would be quite nice. And also, just lastly, let me share with you a small tip that I think can save you from having some destroyed images. And that is just avoid having your finger in front of the lens. You will see if you have your finger in front of the right eye lens, because that's on your screen. But if you have it in front of your left lens, you won't see that, and you only discover that later when you look at your photos at home. So just be aware of that. Avoid fingers in front of the lenses. And with that, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and God bless.